Thank you. Questions for the committee? Dr. Lau.
Joseph Lau. It appears that, I assume that is the case, that you have no interaction with the DGA committee prior to them going about their work. If you have the opportunity to do so, let's say in the future, what kind of interactions that you may like to have? That is, you would like to ask some type of answer from the DGA recommendation in a form that they could use and to be useful. So what kind of question you may ask them?
That's directed to me?
I think it's probably to all three.
Okay. Well, I'll take a whack at it. Well, of course, the Dietary Guidelines Committee doesn't sit simultaneously with these other expert committees. But I think the challenge for a future Dietary Guidelines Committee is to think through how these guidelines will actually be used. And more, the USDA in particular is asking committees to align whatever food program it is with the dietary guidelines. And that is it's a new use for the dietary guidelines since they were first created. And we need some science to do that with. And that is not currently part of the charge of the Dietary Guidelines Committee. So I guess I would not direct this to the committee. I would direct it to the organizations that are writing the charge for the Dietary Guidelines Committee, USDA and HHS, and say, this is something we need to think more about because of how the guidelines are now being used. That's my answer, but we have two other people who might want to answer that question.
I would have to say yes. I would agree absolutely 100%. We, the end users in school nutrition, have seen the real consequences, both pros and cons, of aligning ourselves with the dietary guidelines. But again, keeping the larger picture, I think, is the most important thing. We've got to realize that these children who are 5, and in some cases from WIC, we feed WIC kids too in Head Start in our schools. So from 3 to 18, or until they age out from special ed, which can be up to 21 years of age, there are a lot of differing dietary needs going on, and one size does not fit all. And that's been a challenge for us to try to fit prescriptive meal pattern data, nutrition analysis into a meal pattern that is acceptable to students, but also meets caloric needs, fat needs, and also knowing that every 5 years the science is going to change, which is good. That's not a bad thing, but it impacts us for 10 years or longer. So we need to make sure that we're following, I think, the best science that's out there, and that's really strongly based on research that's available on children. And if it's not available, then I think it should give us pause about whether to make a recommendation or not.
Dr. DGAs.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Other questions from the committee? Yes.
Yeah.
Dr. Brett Smith.
Thank you all for your presentations. It's really helpful to hear how the guidelines are used and be reminded of that to sort of bring this to a practical level. I have a question for you, Kathleen. It was in regard to your analysis of looking at the nutrients and the sufficiency of the nutrients versus the food groups. When you did that analysis of NHANES, did you account for the within-person variability? In other words, looking at the usual intakes distribution, because if you were looking at the distribution of single-day intakes, you're more likely to be finding a so-called inadequacy.
We were constrained by the number of days of number of individuals who had multiple days of intake. If you read our report, you will see that in 8 years we had precisely 27 breastfeeding women, and we didn't know how breastfeeding they were. So this is a super duper challenge in terms of numbers. But the the statistical group at the University of Iowa who conducted the analyses for us definitely controlled for the usual diet. They used the multiple days of intake that we had.
Yes, Dr. Sepulveda.
Martin Sepulveda, and thank you all for your informative presentations. My question is how long does it take you with an average guideline in terms of the amount of change that's in it for you to change what you have to change to align with the new guideline? And is there something about that experience that would have you make a recommendation about something that the DGAC might do differently?
I'll give you a fast answer for WIC. It's once every 10 years. WIC's food packages are reviewed, so that's every other set of dietary guidelines. That's basically how often it is.
For the school nutrition program, it's every 5 years whenever CNR is accomplished. I would say the recommendation would be that we need to, again, take into effect the science, because it's going to take, I'll give you a perfect example. When the DGAs were, or when the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act was passed in 2010, within 6 months, we had to turn around and change our programs to meet all of the requirements of the meal pattern, which isn't the DGA committee's fault, but it's a USDA regulation. The first menus that I planned in my district took over 200 hours. And that's a burden that I've planned menus for many, many years, and that's way outside the realm. Now that has gotten better as we've gotten guidance, but I would say that if you're going to have major changes in a program, that we pilot programs in terms of not the recommendations that you have, but that you go back and suggest perhaps to the people who write the regulations that we enter a pilot phase to give us a chance to work out any of the little glitches and things that might come up.
Sounds like the glitches oftentimes are pretty big.
Yes.
I'm wondering about the appropriateness of the regulations as they were jumped into. I mean, I think that idea of piloting is probably a very, very good idea.
Well, I think, we were part of the conversation from the implementation of the comment period, and SNA actually recommended pilot programs. And the regulations came so fast and furious that within 5 years we've had 2,500 pages of technical guidance. And, we have to know all that, and things change so fast that you feel like a whirling dervish. It's hard to get one thing down, and you can imagine people like me who have a staff, and we have RDs on staff, and we have qualified people who can work through these problems, but there are many schools in the country, it's a one school district that has a cook. He is responsible for the same regulations that I am. And it just caused a lot of problems, and it also trickles down through the whole supply chain. Industry doesn't know what to do. Getting it into distribution is a challenge. So there are a lot of challenges by dumping regulations on folks in an interest to make a wholesale change and to make it happen quick. We all know that people don't change their habits in 1 or 2 years or 5 or 10 years. It's a lifelong, gradual kind of process, and that's what we would recommend.
For the WIC program, the committee recommended that the Food and Nutrition Service of USDA implement in some states before others so that it could see what the problems were and make changes along the way, recognizing that when there's a final date for implementation, most states wait until the last day to do it. So that gave them some running time to learn more. We hope they'll choose to do that.
Other question? Yes. I'm sorry, Janet.
Sorry. No, it was
you got to raise your hand high.
Sorry. I was just going to say, specifically for our education materials, we usually have a 5-year cycle. So if it's hit 5 years, we say either update it or take it down. And since our federal colleagues, we know when the new guidelines are coming out. If we usually wait until it comes out, if we're close to updating material.
Dr. Lupton.
Can you tell me how exactly the dietary guidelines get translated into these specific requirements for school lunches or whatever? What's the process that has to go through?
USDA promulgates guidelines, and in the case of menus, there's a meal pattern, and the meal pattern that we are currently under includes 5 components: milk or dairy, lean proteins or meat alternates, fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. And within that realm, there are specific limits. Let's take vegetables. We have to serve so many vegetable subgroups a week, so many greens, so many dark greens, so many reds, so many starches. It's very, very prescriptive all the way down. In all of that, then there are calorie limits, and there are sodium limits, there are fat limits, and so we have to plan that puzzle so that we have the nutritional analysis tools that help us know whether we're meeting that or not, all while trying to make it look good and taste good to our kids.
Dr. Lupton, follow up?
It's not really the dietary guidelines, right? It's something that's happening after the dietary guidelines. Is that correct?
It is, and I know that there's some discussion and research that shows nutrient standard menu planning versus food group menu planning. For us, I think food groups, although not all of our members would agree, seems to be the best approach. But when you isolate nutrients, like sometimes the dietary guidelines has done in the past, that causes specific problems. And for example, now the hot topic is sodium, because July we go into Target 2 sodium restrictions. So, and it goes on out to 2022. And so when you talk about those specific nutrients, what our recommendation would be is that there's strong enough science done with children that you would actually recommend that this target be met, however it's going to be met down the road.
Yes, Robert.
I just wanted to thank Dr. Rasmussen, because I think that was a very important analysis, and it's going to cause a lot of problems, as we work out how to fix it. But if you don't know what it is, you can't, make the first step.
Thank you for that compliment. I didn't mean to make trouble for you, but I do think it is something we should understand about how the dietary guidelines are being implemented, and that if we're going to continue to do that, we need a better way of doing it.
Yes. Dr. Atkins.
So just so I get this straight, so the Food and Nutrition Services of the USDA takes the dietary guidelines and then develops these regulations of what you should feed the school children. Do they do any modeling about feasibility given the food supply and what the level of sodium is, or anything like that, or is that responsibility all sort of sent out to the local quarters?
Well, it ends up on our plates, so to speak. But I think they do try to review the science that's out there and look at what this committee has done in terms of the recommendations. But I can't speak to how much they really delve into the science before they make.
The practical feasibility. So they say you have to have a certain level of sodium, but has anybody done any calculations on the type of food patterns, and are the available sources of food that are within, a certain economic?
I think the current sodium recommendations are really largely based on the American Heart Association standards, and there's obviously, sodium is one of those topics like fat. It changed over time, so that's where they base it on, and then they go and do calculations on, okay, if we have this much as the recommendation, how do we go about translating that into so many milligrams per meal or per week? Because we could actually serve macaroni and cheese and grilled cheese sandwiches, which is going to knock your sodium out of the ballpark on one day, but over the week we would want it to meet within the target range. So I can't really answer what all they do. That's a question that is really for them.
Dr. Rasmussen.
I think I just want to tell everyone there's another set of reports that's between the dietary guidelines and where the rubber meets the road in our school lunch programs. There's a full school nutrition report. Maybe Ann could say more about that. That would help people to understand how the dietary guidelines wind up on your doorstep, in what form.
Dr. Yakin.
Thank you. Yes, there is a report on school lunch and school breakfast programs, and that was published in 2010 or something. Somebody have to correct me on that. But at any rate, those set the nutrient standards, and those are based on the dietary reference intakes largely, but then aligned with the dietary guidelines for Americans.
Thank you. Yes. Next. Dr. Frank.
So between, thank you, by the way, for your presentations. They were excellent. And so as I'm following the process, between the task of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee and by the time the rubber meets the road, so to speak, there's a lot of stuff that happens. At the same time, we know that the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee comes from a position of looking at the science. And so when I think about the emergence of implementation science, to what extent would you recommend that the DGA seat starts to include implementation science results or reports in their deliberations of the state of the science? And to what degree do you think that should be part of the charge to that committee?
I believe the latest policy document had a whole section on implementation and looking at the best way to implement the dietary guidelines throughout different systems, communities, schools. And speaking, I mean, personally, I mean, that's where I work at NIH in implementation science, and I think it's a growing field. It's still a young field, but I definitely think it's an important area.
Just as a follow-up, I think part of the question was whether or not there have been evidence-based reviews produced to help get to the implementation science part of it, as opposed to just ideas about how to implement. Is that part?
I think one of the issues here is that the dietary guidelines are used in so many specific ways. We have a whole variety of federal programs that are now being expected to be aligned with them. I think it would be useful for the committee to think about each one of those ways systematically, because it can be done at this juncture, how they would be used, and whether there is, whether anything you're doing is likely to cause more of a problem for one of those uses than other uses. For example, sodium in the school lunch program is a pretty big challenge. But nonetheless, to be able to think through all the ways these are used and to see what you learn from doing that. It's not clear to me that an implementation science review is the next logical step, but I do think understanding the full range of how the federal government is using these in each of its programs would be really helpful, because it would identify the places where it's uncomfortable.
So no other questions? I'd like to thank our panelists. Thank you very much for your